think about concentration camps, the first thing that probably comes to mind is Nazi Germany. But America had a concentration camp of its own, and its story is so horrifying, it's been erased from history. This is the Devil's Punch Bowl in Natchez, Mississippi. From above, it looks like a jungle. From below, it is a lush green forest waiting to be explored. But here, there is a dirty secret intentionally buried by historians and mainstream media. American death camps. Thousands of free black slaves were held in this concentration camp and treated in gruesome ways. Experts estimate that in just 1 year, more than 20,000 free black people died here. But much of its history remains a mystery. Even to this day, here is the true story of the Devil's Punch Bowl. In school, we are taught that in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation set African Americans in rebel states free. Later, after the Civil War, the 13th Amendment liberated all U.S. slaves, no matter where they lived. It was the beginning of life out of bondage. Although this is true, it was a lot more complicated than that. In the South, there were 4 million slaves. They were a crucial component in keeping the Confederate war effort going. Even though Abraham Lincoln said the president had no constitutional right to attack slavery, the war changed everything. Recently, freed black people were facing a new challenge: white race brutality and prejudice. Even though slavery was over, state governments all around the South put together laws called the Black Codes. It was a time of great change, one that the white race wasn't ready to accept. That's because slavery played a crucial factor in their economy. It was basically the economic engine of the South. Black Codes gave some rights to black people, like the ability to own property, get married, and bring lawsuits to court. But they also had severe restrictions. For example, black individuals were not allowed to testify against white people, serve on juries, or join state militias. The laws also forced black sharecroppers and tenant farmers to sign work contracts yearly with white landowners. If they refused, they could be arrested or hired out. After the Civil War, many black Americans in the South faced tough times despite being free. They lived in poor rural areas with little money. Since they were denied education and fair wages during slavery, they had no choice but to rent land from their former white owners. These renters, known as sharecroppers, had to give a portion of their crops as rent to the landowner. Some former slaves managed to take land from their former masters right after the war ended, but federal troops returned the land to the white landowners soon after. The decade after the Civil War, freed black people fled the South in droves. In this search for true freedom, some of them ended up in Natchez, Mississippi, never to be seen again. In the years following the Civil War, despite their newfound freedom, many black people suffered under the hands of the white, especially in the South. Violence was endemic. Racist terrorism happened on a daily basis. There were disputes over contracts, etiquette, and even the tiniest things. A black person doesn't tip his hat to a white person, and suddenly, people start shooting each other. They didn't let each other pass down the sidewalk. Just all kinds of minor local incidents led to a cycle of violence. Then came political violence. Organized groups like the Ku Klux Klan made life horrible for black people everywhere. Discrimination was rampant. Legal, commercial, social, you name it. Restaurants, hotels, and theaters were segregated. Shops served black people last. They were underpaid and mistreated. It was obvious. The Southern whites had no intention of seeing black people as human beings. In their eyes, they were just cheap labor. So, many blacks fled. By 1880, thousands of former slaves took part in what experts consider the first major migration of freed black people. But the soldiers from the South had other plans. They were angry and resentful that the people they considered property were now free. During the Civil War, Natchez mainly remained undamaged. After New Orleans fell in May 1862, the city surrendered to Flag Officer David G. Farragut. In 1863, Union troops led by Ulysses S. Grant took control of Natchez, and Grant made his temporary headquarters in the mansion known as Rosalie. Many old residents refused to obey the federal authorities. After the Union won the Battle of Vicksburg in July 1863, countless refugees, including former slaves freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, started coming to Natchez and the nearby countryside. The Union Army officers said they didn't have enough resources to support the refugees properly. They planned to help the freed slaves by offering them paid work on government-owned plantations, enlisting able-bodied men to join the Union Army, and creating refugee camps where former slaves could get an education. But as the war dragged on, the plan was never put into action. The leased plantations were poorly managed and often attacked by Confederate troops who controlled the surrounding land. This made life difficult for the refugees trying to rebuild their lives after slavery. But this was not enough. More and more freed Black people started settling here. According to researcher Paula Westbrook, the town of Natchez was overrun. Overnight, the population went up from 10,000 to around 120,000. Some reports indicate that in 1860, Natchez had a population of 6,612 people. That included 4,272 white residents, 2,132 slaves, and 208 free Black people. But by 1870, the population had increased to 9,057, with 3,728 white residents and 5,329 Black residents. Clearly, the number of Black people outnumbered the whites. This raises the question, if around 110,000 to 120,000 Black people arrived in Natchez around 1865, where did they all go by 1870? Sadly, many died right there. Unable to deal with the rise in population, the city turned to the troops still lingering from the war to devise a cruel and effective solution. They made a decision to construct a camp for the freed Black slaves at Devil's Punch Bowl. The troops designed an enclosed area and didn't allow the Black people to leave, explained Don Estes, a former director of the Natchez City Cemetery. Devil's Punch Bowl got its name from its unique appearance. It resembles a large bowl-like hollow, and it's surrounded by tall cliffs covered in trees. This natural formation unintentionally created a perfect place for a death camp. The rugged terrain, isolated location, and cliffs made it difficult for anyone trapped inside to escape. The story here is one of human horror. The army captured and imprisoned the freed Black slaves, then put them in conditions far worse than they dealt with on the plantation. Now, do have in mind that Devil's Punch Bowl is known for high humidity and scorching heat. Here, men had to do hard labor. The extreme weather conditions and backbreaking work caused dehydration, heat exhaustion, and heat stroke. The demanding manual work without rest would have led to excruciating muscle pain, fatigue, and other serious health problems. As for the women and children left behind, they were deprived of food and water and died from starvation. They were prone to disease and infections, which often led to a slow and painful death. Smallpox was a classic example. This was a severe and deadly viral infection. It quickly spread from person to person, causing scarring, disfigurement, and eventually death. The disease starts with flu-like symptoms such as fever, muscle pain, fatigue, back pain, and vomiting. In a couple of days, it progresses to red and flat spots all around the body. Within a day or two, most of the spots turn into small blisters. Eventually, scabs formed and fell off, leaving deep scars. Since the prisoners were forced to live in terrible conditions and cramped areas, the disease quickly spread and took many lives. But the savage treatment didn't end. Even after their death, Westbrook explained that the army didn't let the Black people remove the bodies of the deceased. They just handed them some shovels and told the prisoners to bury the bodies exactly where they died. It is said that the prisoners begged to be let out, claiming they wanted to go back to the plantations, anywhere but here. The thing is, Devil's Punch Bowl didn't have just one, but 3 mass grave sites. As the Civil War ended and when emancipation began, those who were once enslaved and technically freed found themselves in a vulnerable position, not fully integrated into society. Those formerly freed and those who had escaped from slavery were captured and confined in what was known as contraband camps. These camps got their name because, like contraband goods, these individuals were considered property by Union troops. The troops, despite being on the side of abolishing slavery, sometimes treated the freed and escaped slaves as commodities, rather than restoring their full humanity and rights as free individuals. They would do this to serve their own interests. That's why a lot of Black people ended up confined in these camps. Most of the stories here are supported by the locals, but there is little historical evidence. Locals say that during heavy rains and flooding, human skeletons occasionally wash ashore. Today, the area has a ton of wild peach trees. Although peaches are a popular fruit, the locals say they know better than to touch this product. That's because it has been fertilized with the blood of the people who died there. These people who dreamt of building their lives away from the master's whip ended up owned, tortured, and enslaved once again. They never got the chance to build their businesses, amass wealth, and provide a good life for their offspring. They never got to experience true happiness, true freedom. The truth was that Black people were never intended to be citizens of this country, never intended to become political leaders, own land, or make meaningful contributions. It was never in the grand design. They were meant to be mortgaged and used as collateral. If it weren't for all those civil rights movements, protests, boycotts, and marches, we would still be stuck in a system of racial discrimination, segregation, and violence. So, Why isn't the massacre in the Devil's Punch Bowl included in mainstream history? It's simple. It's just too dark and controversial. They want to hide all of the evil they have done, but we will never stop sharing the truth. Like and subscribe to the channel to join us on the movement. We aren't just telling stories, we're changing lives and waking the culture up. The historian Roscoe Barnes said for Yahoo News that much of the information being spread about this place is simply inaccurate. He believes that years of exaggerations and misconceptions have given rise to a myth built on pro-Confederate propaganda. Barnes stated that while some people did die there, it was not anything like a concentration camp. Instead, both blacks and white individuals lost their lives due to an epidemic, and the conditions were challenging for everyone involved. However, he explained that there was no intentional torture or punishment based on race. Really? I don't think so. Barnes said that there is no doubt that after the Civil War, thousands of newly freed African Americans from the South headed north in search of safety and support from Union soldiers. They sought refuge from Confederate forces. Mimi Miller, the executive director emerita at the historical Natchez Foundation, added that many of these African Americans specifically chose Natchez because it was the biggest city in Mississippi at the time and a significant river port. The city was a beacon of hope for these recently liberated people who wanted a chance for a better life. Union forces held control over Natchez, while most of the state remained under Confederate control. The year was 1863, and even though the Union had gained control of the Mississippi River that July, the war was still ongoing. In the wake of this development, numerous formerly enslaved people flocked to Natchez and other liberated towns and cities. This complicated things for the northern troops, so they set up refugee camps. According to Esser Seshay Ab Heder Clifford and Boxley, these camps were crowded and a lot of people died there. The living conditions were not good, sanitization was bad, drinking water from the Mississippi River was risky, and a lot of people got sick and died. The territory was disorganized and poorly planned. There was a lack of proper coordination, structure, and efficiency. Boxley believes African Americans were not the only ones who died here. Union soldiers and white residents also lost their lives during this period. This is why the numbers were lower. The myth of the concentration camp, as Boxley explains, is more connected with the anti-Union Army sentiment, which is still popular today. Barnes stated that even though the conditions in the refugee camps were bad, the freed black people didn't have to stay there. Because the Union troops were so overwhelmed by the influx of refugees, they encouraged some of them to go back to their plantations and try to build a new relationship with their former masters. In the book, The Black Experience in Natchez, Ron Davis, a history professor at California State University, talks in great detail about how the troops were unprepared to handle the number of refugees. After gaining freedom, some of the formerly enslaved people were enlisted into the Union Army. Others found work as paid laborers on plantations. According to Davis, the initial idea for the refugee camps was to serve as temporary shelters and also employment agencies, essentially helping people find jobs. They even planned to bring in northern teachers to educate those in the camps. However, almost none of the intended plans for the Natchez black population came true. The plantations white people were leasing didn't have any management or organization. They were often raided by Confederate troops. This caused a lot more problems. The army barracks and refugee camps were ill-equipped, understaffed, and overwhelmed by sickness, disease, and racial discrimination. Given the harsh realities of the Civil War and the difficulties faced by the black community, it's truly remarkable that any of the black participants managed to survive the dark stuff that happened there. So, why does the myth about the concentration camp live on? According to Barnes, there are a ton of urban legends that won't die. And since we are in the age of social media, these legends go viral. What slavery, anti-black sentiment, and Jim Crow did left a wake of destruction. It used dehumanization, marginalization, fear, and torture as a part of daily life. The people who grew up in this kind of environment know better than to trust those in power. That's because the stories get passed down from mother to child. And in the black community, where oppression was rampant, it scarred generations of people. The thing is, I don't believe that the Devil's Punch Bowl story was just a myth. You see, this is not the first time in history that we see these so-called refugee camps across America, promising to help people build a new future for themselves outside of slavery, only to end up in horrible living conditions, sick and dead. Abigail Cooper, an assistant professor of history, did research on the experiences of African Americans in refugee camps during the Civil War. Over 200 refugee camps were established at that time, with more than 800,000 African Americans passing through them at some point. Most of the people who lived there were ex-slaves, slaves, or those who came to find family members who were separated and sold to different masters. These camps became places of monumental transformation for black people. It was a time when the black community was starting to see America not as an enslaver, but as their home. The camps, however, were far from what they envisioned. The conditions were grim, disease rampant, People lived in constant fear of raids from white Southerners. In many of these camps, white people also came to seek shelter from the war, but they were treated differently from blacks. For example, they would get more rations. Despite these hardships, the camps provided black people with their first taste of freedom. Families reunited. It brought people together from various cultures and traditions. Some camps had access to education. Among the black people who lived there, a good pair of shoes was a big part of their lives. When they used to work on plantations, the slave owners would lock their shoes at night so they couldn't get a chance to escape. Having a good pair of shoes was crucial for the challenging journey to the camps. People needed footwear to travel the forests and get through rough terrain. Without shoes, it was easy to spot an escaped slave in a crowd. This made black people vulnerable to kidnappers and violence. What's interesting is that refugees found creative ways to protect themselves. They carried money and protective charms in their shoes. Some even crafted makeshift footwear from plantain leaves, which had a strong smell that helped throw off the scent of the hounds used by patrollers and former owners. These people were trying to make their homes as best as they could, with the little things they had. But this was a long journey. There were racial terror lynchings happening all around the country. Thousands more were injured and assaulted. Most of these retaliatory killings were unaccounted for, but they happened. They shaped a tragic period in American history. Many white Southerners couldn't fathom the idea of freeing their black slaves, so they would try to reclaim their superiority by any means necessary. To sum up, history seems to tell what it wants people to know. It is only when we dig a little deeper that we start to reveal the truth. While we can't know for sure if the Devil's Punch Bowl story is real or just a myth, I can see it happening. This is why it's so important for us to research the facts for ourselves and see what many documents leave out. If I had to pick what hurt me the most about this story, it is the fact that every soul that died here was ripped out of ever leaving a mark on history. They could have been entrepreneurs, authors, innovators, and so much more. But their lives were cut short, just when they thought they were free. It is just heartbreaking. The reality is, this one clip can't possibly do justice and reveal all the atrocities and heartbreak that black people suffered over the years, even after slavery was abolished. Like many aspects of the United States history, the cruel actions committed by government officials have been deliberately downplayed to reduce shame and make people forget. But there is no doubt in my mind that thousands suffered inhumane conditions at these camps. The truth about Devil's Punch Bowl may never be fully revealed in history books, so it's up to us to educate ourselves. Have you heard about this part of our country's history? Share your thoughts on all this in the comments below. I would love to know what you think. The video on the screen shares some hidden black history the US government tried to erase. It was really heartbreaking for us to make, but the truth needed to be told. Click on it now to watch. We'll see you over there.